So thanks for that introduction, Rob, and I'm excited to be part of this speaker series. As Rob mentioned, I have a background in counseling and a PhD in educational psychology, and this talk really comes from my dissertation research, which looked at social justice in the context of education. And then since then, I've also written a paper with Dr. Jeff Sugarman looking at the implications for psychology, because I have kind of a background in both of those fields. So I was interested in the topic after hearing the term so much and being curious as to what people meant when they said it, and asking people and not always getting a satisfactory response, and realizing that although I had expressed commitment to social justice, I also didn't always have a satisfactory response to what exactly that was and what exactly that meant. So this is a critical perspective. I'm going to look at it historically and theoretically, which is my background. Now, I should say, because we're on Zoom, and so I'm teaching on Zoom as well right now, and it feels like I'm inviting you into my home. So you might see behind me people from my family that are coming. We are having the fun experience right now of having a child with COVID. So everyone is home. We're all isolating here. I don't mind teaching on Zoom. We've been doing this now for a while because it feels like it gives a window into the care work that goes on, often unacknowledged in just in our society. So this is, it kind of makes everybody, puts everybody on an equal footing in terms of we're in our homes, you see the care work going on, the people that we're taking care of. I'm coming to you from East Vancouver. So my home is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people in sort of the north end of East Vancouver. So just to give you an overview here, let me see how I do this. What I'm going to be looking at is looking at some of the problems with social justice, both generally and specific to psychology. Looking at the history of social justice in the West. So I'm limited by speaking English, reading English. That's how I can trace the term. It's been discussed in other languages, other cultures as well, that specific term. But my research is specifically in terms of Western countries where it's been published. Looking at what we learned from this history, I'm going to argue that there's a best way of thinking about social justice, which comes from McIntyre's work. And I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the historical method I used in case there's graduate students that are interested in that. I won't spend a lot of time on that. And then looking at the implications of this work for psychology and counseling. So social justice. I just am curious, I know you can't respond here, but I would be interested to hear what your reaction to this term was. If we were in a group, I would ask you. This is a term that is very evocative for people. Some people have a lot of enthusiasm for social justice, and I just have a couple quotes there up that they find it to be very evocative, very emotional, very mobilizing. They're passionate about it. People will say, even in my classes, I'm passionate about social justice. I'm really interested in social justice. And this tends to be my experience in academia, is a lot of people will express a commitment to social justice. There's also, and I'm sure you have noticed on the news, or maybe you feel this way yourself, or you have heard people that have a lot of contempt for social justice. And maybe nobody had as much contempt for social justice as Friedrich von Hayek, who wrote a book in the 1970s called The Mirage of Social Justice, and wrote that this term was entirely empty and meaningless, nothing more than a quasi-religious belief with no content whatever, that serves merely to insinuate that we ought to consent to a demand of some particular group. And he goes on. So this, often the contempt or the derision for social justice comes out when you hear people talking about social justice warriors in sort of a derogatory way, or being really critical of people that express a commitment to social justice. There in psychology and counseling, my experience has been that there is widespread commitment, enthusiasm for social justice. It comes up in mission statements of grad programs. There's labs that are devoted to social justice, conferences devoted to the topic. The last in-person conference I went to at APA, social justice was written on the floor and projected on the walls. Journal articles on that topic, some of which I've written, books devoted to social justice, and so on. It also, if you really pay close attention, it's a term that can be used to defend any numbers of policies or programs, even those that are contradictory. So you have people using social justice in defense of what they would like to do, if you look closely. This is just a quote from American Psychological Association, the presidential address, talking about how psychology has contributed to social justice and calling for an ongoing commitment to that. This slide shows the enthusiasm for social justice in publications in PsycInfo. So this is just, I searched, if you search social justice as a term, or as a subject, sorry, on PsycInfo by decade or every 5 years, you can see the increase since about the 1980s, 1985, really, it goes up quite steeply. And of course, the number of publications will go up because PsycInfo, there's just more publications now, but the dark blue line is the proportion. So not only has the number of publications on social justice increased, but the proportion of publications in relation to what else is being published has increased as well. Now, if you look, there's an interesting little blip at the start right there in 1915 to about 1925. And those references mostly refer to streaming or vocational streaming in schools, which was referred to as social justice at the time. There was a big push to develop streaming programs and at that point. So that's just kind of an interesting historical note. So, I mean, I'm sure as you've gathered from this, the title of the talk, there are some problems with social justice in psychology. And here's 3 of them. First, it's often just not defined. References are very vague. It's kind of it's assumed that people will know what you're talking about when you say it without clearly defining what it is. But quite often people do define what they mean by social justice, and there are a number of theories of social justice. So the publications on social justice often pull from one or more of those theories, and there's multiple possible ways of defining it. So you can define it in different ways, and there's different metrics. The goods of social justice can be identified in different forms. And a lot of them have something in common with each other, and there's no pluralism in academia is not really a problem, as this the whole lecture series is pointing out. But it does become a problem when you're using a particular term or particular concept in support of different programs, because it can just be used to support just about anything. And you see this maybe more in education than in psychology, but both can happen. So in education, for example, you have people that talk about standardized testing, which is a controversial topic. People in support of standardized testing do so with reference to social justice, and people against it also do so with reference to social justice. So it can be used variously. As a consequence of this kind of multiple meaning or polysemy, there's derision for social justice and for its proponents. And it just comes across like, Hayek said that this is sort of somewhat seems to be a meaningless term if it can be used in any which way, and that people that use it often don't seem to have a clear idea what they're talking about. And he's not wrong in that. That is in fact the case. People have some vague ideas, but there certainly could be more conceptual clarity around the term. And it's unfortunate because this is a term that has had great historical importance for marginalized groups. Who have used this term to gather support for instances where marginalized groups are being promises made to them have not been lived up to, and to gather support for those causes, to kind of draw attention to the problems with the state, for example. It's very hard to defend it. It's a historical term that's important, but it's hard to defend a very nebulous concept. Like it is the case that it's not often clearly defined. So it becomes difficult to continue to have that term be used if it can't be clearly defined. As well, it's nearly impossible to evaluate a program that claims social justice as its aim if what is meant by the key concept is not clear. If we want to evaluate that, evaluate a program in terms of its contribution to social justice, we need to be very clear and have some consensus around what we mean by the term. Otherwise, we can evaluate the program in terms of the objectives or the aims as we define it. But in order to use a term like that is being used widely, there needs to be some sort of consensus about the meaning. So quite often, social justice theories have similar meaning. It has something to do with egalitarianism, equality, and whether the metrics are a little bit different. But what has happened with this polysemy is that it really can be defined in any way, and including most recently, there's a neoliberal variant of social justice that I think is problematic. So neoliberal social justice, and I'll go on to explain neoliberalism a little bit more, but neoliberal social justice is kind of a new kid on the block in the social justice literature. And this variant of social justice focuses quite on individual responsibility and brackets out any structural or systemic cause of inequality. So it's about what the individual does and the choices that they make. In this view, the government or the state, it shouldn't be involved in any way in redistributing wealth to try to increase equality. So social welfare programs are out, taxation is out mostly, any sort of work done to establish equal opportunities is out. What the state should be involved in is expanding markets, and that's what will increase. That's what social justice is in this view, is giving individuals the opportunity to make more market choices in more realms of their life. So all realms of human life, in healthcare and schools, etc., that will enable people to flourish. So the quotation there at the bottom is from an article posted on the Heritage Foundation website, which has taken a great interest recently in social justice. So just for those of you that don't know what neoliberalism is, I mean, this is a term that gets a lot of play now in academia. It's probably the ideology that if anything is hegemonic, neoliberalism is hegemonic around the globe. It's a particular ideology that began in the 1930s, was advanced very intentionally in the 1970s by some academics and the corporate elite, business leaders, through think tanks and lobby efforts. It became prominent in the 1980s, and it's now hegemonic around the globe. Key beliefs of neoliberalism include that individuals and groups have limited rationality, are good at making some choices, limited to kind of like immediate market choices, but not good at long-range planning. So any efforts to kind of for social engineering or redistribution of wealth are bound to fail because of this limited rationality. In contrast, the market is considered to be an excellent information processor and can take individual choices and kind of crunch that data and then help us to make good choices. So the argument goes that to maximize well-being for all, the state should really focus on creating and supporting markets in all realms of human life, and that includes expanding their global reach, and that's been through unelected organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, through policies that are outlined in the Washington Consensus, and you can look that up if you're interested in those, but those include like deregulation of markets, reduced corporate taxes. So because of that, because these are unelected bodies that are are advancing this idea. It's really hard to displace, and it has become hegemonic because of that. Freedom in this view is conceived as having more market choices. So individuals are really given the opportunity to have their market. Now, one of the effects of this, because individuals are considered to have limited rationality, is democratic processes are handed over to the market to some extent. So the decisions quickly become, the market is the determinant of them, not people necessarily. Sometimes neoliberalism is associated with classical liberalism or libertarianism, but it's really a whole different beast. And scholars that study liberalism have made that kind of the focus of their work, like Frieden, there's a link down there, say that because of the different ontological views of people, this is really not a form of liberalism. It just deviates too far from key liberal beliefs, and it's a form of oligarchy where a small percentage of people make the decisions. So that's just a primer on that. Harvey has a great brief history of neoliberalism if you're interested. The impacts of neoliberalism. So the impacts are, and I'm going to come back around to social justice, I promise. This is just, I want to make clear what I mean, or why this is kind of a paradox when we talk about neoliberal social justice and how it relates to psychology. So what impacts of this form, this ideological form, which has been dominant for the past 30, 40 years, is really high income inequality, both within and between countries. There has been redistribution, has continued, but rather than moving from the rich to the poor, it's gone from the poor to the rich. And there's all sorts of statistics to support that in terms of how people at the top of corporate structures, how their wages have increased while other people's have stagnated. And I think there's a inequality now is as high as it's been since the 1920s. So the inequality between the rich and the poor. And there's research as well, and Wilkinson and Pickett have done a lot of this work that look at how inequality is associated with increased social and health problems. And for those of you that work as counselors, problems that you see in your practices, no doubt, or in the agencies you work in. For those of us that teach in academia, amongst our students. And this is not just for people that are poor, this is just across the board. So another effect of neoliberalism has just been reduced support for public institutions and the democratic process. I talked about that before. And increased poverty, especially for those that can't participate in the market. So children, people with disabilities, mothers, so people that don't, because the life has become more market-based, if you're outside of the market, there's increased poverty. So hopefully you see neoliberalism has caused this increase in inequality, the irony of neoliberal social justice. And the irony, it's particularly ironic given that Hayek, who was one of the kind of the founders of the neoliberal ideology, wrote so vehemently against it, against social justice, was so said, the greatest service I can render to my fellow men would be that I could make the speakers and writers among them thoroughly ashamed ever again to employ the term social justice. But now this sudden increase in interest in social justice amongst those who are very supportive of neoliberal policy. So this just goes to show, I think, what the point I'm trying to make is that when you have a term that is so polysemous, that can be defined in any which way, it opens it up to any form of discourse, or you can talk about it in any which way. And I think this is a large part of the rationale for my critical look at social justice, is to say, hey, you know, this is causing some real, this ideology is causing some real problems for people who are now claiming this term. So we need to be really clear about what we mean by it. So neoliberalism and psychology, this is interesting. And this really, this work has been done quite a lot by Jeff Sugarman. And I have a couple papers with Jeff where we've looked at this, but neoliberalism wants to individualize what many people would argue are better conceived of as socio-political or economic problems. And so that has implications for social policy. There's a real focus on, for example, in housing, there's a focus on individual people who are homeless rather than housing policies that are national. So we have in Canada, haven't had a national housing policy, but that's not the focus. It also has a huge impact on the way people understand themselves and their lives. And I see this in my students, this real focus on understanding life in terms of can I change my attitude for it to be better? Or can I, what are the particular skills that I need to employ? How can I work on my resume to maximize my chances? And those things aren't bad in and of themselves, but there's just this lack of systemic thinking that goes along with it. And that neoliberal selfhood is this kind of way that people have come to be encouraged to think of themselves as brands to advance market goods that they need to constantly be developing. They're entrepreneurs of themselves. And that Nicholas Rose wrote a lot about that. Foucault did as well. And Jeff Sugarman has written most recently about that. And Stephen Vassallo actually also has an interesting book on that that's just out recently. Psychology also has a history of the same problem of individualizing problems. So when we look at the history of psychology, you can see the same type of trend. So you have problems like women's hysteria in the late 1800s, early 1900s, being interpreted in terms of, as individual failing rather than taking into account their subjugation within the political system. Poverty in children sometimes is interpreted as problems of the individual child self-regulating, whereas the problem is really they're hungry or they're poor, or they're living in a really unstable context. The intelligence test movement is problematic. So psychology doesn't have this blameless history. It actually has a really problematic history that I think for those of us that are in the field need to kind of constantly have before us. Psychology benefits from neoliberalism. It's as much as people that I meet that are psychologists and counselors are good-hearted, they want to help people, they are, their field of study is embedded in the market economy, and psychology is a market product. And neoliberalism, by individuating problems, has increased the psychological market. So they have benefited from that. There's increased market demand for psychological services. There's more problems are interpreted as mental illness, but also people have, as freedom is conceived as market choice, there's a need for people to help, psychologists to help people make good choices. So there's a whole area that has risen up in terms of helping make choices. The coaching has expanded, decision professionals have expanded, there's increased demand for therapists. There just are the whole culture, the therapeutic culture has expanded and is quite susceptible to aligning with neoliberalism. I think inadvertently, not intentionally. I don't think that's intentional on the part of therapists or counselors or educators that I meet, but this has been kind of a happy alignment in terms of the outcomes and the benefit to psychology from this particular ideology. So just to recap the problem, there's this lack of conceptual consensus about what social justices mean. It's not clear often what people are talking about when they claim a commitment to social justice. It's not clear how their programs can be evaluated if we have no consensus about the meaning of the term. And it's very hard then to defend that term, even if you have a strong commitment to it, if there's not a consensus on its meaning. And it has allowed a proliferation of views of social justice, including neoliberal social justice, which is neoliberalism is associated with increased inequality. And most people that claim a commitment to social justice would not be for expanded inequality. So you've got this kind of paradoxical situation. What we have now is more and more people talking about social justice for whatever reason, and an undermining of institutions that have historically supported social justice, as well as an undermining of the term. And I think this problem is particularly urgent to address in psychology and counseling because of the historical tendency to individualize problems, which aligns with neoliberalism, which then exacerbates inequality. And it's because of that, it's not always clear that psychologists are doing social justice, despite their claims. I think it requires a real soul searching on the parts of counselors and psychologists to think about what exactly they are doing. So this brings us to how can, we have all these different views of social justice now, some of which are presumably better than others, but what is the way that we can differentiate between them, or say, like, what is the best account? What is the way of figuring out what we mean by social justice if we wish to defend the term and defend it, but also think critically about it? So we need to have some sort of consensus about that. And how do we do that? That's challenging in a context where relativism has often been the answer, like what what you think is social justice is fine, and what that person thinks is fine. And there's been efforts to study it that way, to look at what people mean by the term, but I find that to be unsatisfactory, to look at what people mean by the term and then to develop a definition in that way. It's not clear to me that the people that you ask necessarily have a good understanding of the term at all. They can tell you what they're doing with it, but if we're all doing different things, then it just leads to the same problem. So what I want to propose is that social justice is a historical product. So it's an idea that we have about justice, and it has a particular history. So it's very hard to say this is what it is, because it's not really a thing. It's a notion, it's an idea, but it's a notion that has a particular history and that has developed in a particular context as well. And if we take that really seriously, I think we can have in the least a better understanding of what we're talking about. Now, one of the challenges that I confronted with when I started thinking, okay, I'm going to look at social justice historically, is what you look for in history and what you associate with the term really depends on what your contemporary understanding of the concept is. So there are books about social justice that are historical accounts that have no overlap whatsoever, none, like completely different. You think they're talking about totally different things. And it's because they're advancing different viewpoints of social justice. Some are arguing that for kind of like a market-based understanding of social justice, and they tend to go back to Tapparelli, mid-18th century Italian Catholic priest who had a kind of an anti-liberal view, and other views take a more Rawlsian view and look at a liberal account, but they have no overlap. Another challenge is that when you're looking at social justice, there's the term, so you can look for the term specifically. There's also the concept that's kind of behind the term, which maybe have their own historical process of developing. And there's practices that are referred to by the term, and those again are kind of have their own historical process. So you have all of those. So I will just let you know what I did quickly in case you're interested, and I'm giving you some resources there. The approach that I took was to look to philosophical hermeneutics as a guide. And the reason for that is that it's specifically interested in advancing knowledge in the social and human sciences and looking at how that develops. The writers that I referred to quite a bit are Gadamer and McIntyre in that. What the aim is to develop historically affected consciousness. So where you look at how parts and the whole fit together, and you kind of have this hermeneutic process where you go back and forth, and you understand that your own viewpoint, your contemporary viewpoint, is a particular horizon, and then you give primacy to the historical horizon. So you look historically in order to kind of put your view, your contemporary view, into question. But there's a back and forth between past and present, and trying to understand how has the past influenced my view in the present, and how does my present influence what I look for in the past. What also appealed to me about this approach is that it is not relativistic. So it doesn't say that all views are equal. there's an intentional view to look for a best account of a particular form of justice, and this idea that you can find that, it's possible to find that. But the standards of justification also arise from this history. And McIntyre articulates that clearly. He says, a best account is really able to explain, narrate how the argument has gone so far, and why we're in this particular conundrum, why we're having trouble understanding a particular view of justice. So it has kind of a narrative account, and also is able to address contemporary challenges that confound other interpretations. So there's, some views there's certain problems with some views, and they just can't meet certain challenges that have arisen. So this view that I'm going to propose a couple theories at the end. It's not timeless, it's not definitive, it's certainly fallible. It's my best effort to say, this is, I think, what we can say when we're talking about social justice. So let me just give you a brief history, and then I'll go into this in more detail. So you see at the top there's term, concept, practices. In order to try to figure out how to start, I really looked for where the term had been used as my starting place. The first references I could find were in 1824, 1863, both by utilitarians who had this kind of view that maximizing well-being for the most was a form of social justice. It isn't until 1930s that the term really enters popular culture and starts being used frequently all the time. And I'll come back to that. It's associated with the social liberal agenda, and it was used to justify economic redistributive policies like taxation policies. But before you even have those terms, you have certain concepts that are developing behind the scene, that even if those hadn't developed, you wouldn't even have these terms, you wouldn't even have these concerns. So you have liberalism and shifts in idea about poverty and equality, the self and institutions. You have practices that go along with that. In particular, you have revolutions that show that things can be changed. You have liberalism coming in the form of classical liberalism, rising inequality and agitation for reform, the mid-1800s. This causes all sorts of problems, a threat of communism. People are afraid that communists are going to take over. There's the liberals reevaluate what they mean by freedom, develop this notion of positive freedom. I will go over this all in more detail. This is just a quick overview. This really picks up as this distributive policy, distributive justice within nation states. So that's the Keynesian Westphalian frame that develops. The welfare state develops. There's mid-century justice movements in the UN human rights discourse, which is outside of the discourse of social justice, quite interesting. And because of that, because of those other views outside, the complexity of social justice is recognized. It's not just economic, but because it's complex, you have a loss of normativity. You have multiple meanings that develop. At the same time, kind of in a parallel historical process, neoliberalism is growing. You have decrease in support for the welfare institutions and states, but these multiple meanings mean that there's less of a cohesive discourse to confront those. And then you have neoliberal social justice that's arisen. So that's a quick little overview. But let's go back and just look at some of those early ideas that gave rise to social justice. So some of the precursors, pre-1800s, were shifts in thinking in that century about poverty, inequality, and the self. So poverty there was a real push to understand poverty systemically. This is part of the push behind the American and French revolutions, of rating by people like Thomas Paine, Condorcet, Babeuf, Wollstonecraft, push to have it evaluate systemically, not as individual failings. Similarly, inequality is separated. So inequality used to just be the way things were. Justice was viewed, there's no problem with inequality and justice, because people were thought to be different in their qualities and they deserve different things because of that. Inequality, actually Rousseau wrote first about inequality being both of the natural kind, some people were born with differences, and also the social kind. And social inequality related to hierarchies of power, and those could be confronted. So you had this shift in the way that inequality was viewed that came to, some forms of inequality seemed to came to be seen as just reprehensible, requiring revolution. And that's a real shift in history. The way that the self is viewed also changed dramatically. And if you're interested in that, Charles Taylor is the person to read on that. But people began to understand themselves as having agency and also being influenced by structures that operated behind their backs. And the first is probably the economy. It's Adam Smith writing about that, understanding that, oh, there's certain processes, social processes going on that influence the way that individuals act, but individuals are also responsible for those structures. The revolutions, even though they were in particular countries, it showed that socio-political structures could be changed. So structures that had been thought to be ordained by a higher power, they were shifted, and that had an influence around the world. What happened is liberalism came to be predominant, real focus on freedom for the individual, and the initial form of liberalism focused on limiting government power and expanding market participation, which were seen as the primary forms of oppression. Okay, the rise of social justice. So here's like 1800 to about the mid 1900s. 19th century, classical liberalism came to be predominant, and so that just limited government power and expanded market opportunities. But a lot of the critiques from people that had been writing about poverty in the century prior had said that without larger social change, that won't be enough. You're still going to have people that can't participate in the market, can't take advantage of their political opportunities because they don't have education, they don't have healthcare, they have other concerns. And they had kind of foreshadowed that and seen that without this larger social change, it was going to be a problem. And sure enough, that came to pass. Early 1800s, you had stark inequality. Some people got really rich, lots of people really poor, lots of social problems. And there was a lot of critique from reformers. So utilitarians, Christian groups, communists, all criticized the way that classical liberalism had been implemented and the problems that had followed. Liberals, who tended to be in power, were hesitant to legislate any changes because they didn't want to impinge on individual liberty. And individual liberty, freedom for the individual, is really the primary aim of liberalism. And so they couldn't, even like legislating schooling was seen as, oh, that's, counter to bringing in any, counter to this idea that the individual has a right to choose their own life and their own life good. This came a change that really became influential for social justice and was really the impetus behind the idea of social justice, was a new way of thinking about freedom. And the people that brought that about were John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hill Green, two philosophers in the mid 1800s who developed this view of positive freedom. So they said freedom isn't just the absence of constraints. If you want to have freedom for everybody, you have to have constraints for everybody as well. Otherwise, what you have is freedom for one and constraints for all. You basically have a dictatorship, would give one person absolute freedom. But if we're gonna everybody have freedom, you need some constraints. So positive freedom is this idea that in order for people to have freedom and to understand that some constraints are possible, they need to develop capabilities. And in order to develop capabilities, there needs to be a structure of support around them. So they need things like housing and food and stable families and encouraging social environments in order to develop their capabilities to be able to direct their lives and act with freedom. And this was a hugely influential idea because it gave, it shifted the way that the state viewed its actions, and it created a faction within liberalism. So liberalism became split. There's a split between classical liberalism and social liberalism, with social liberalism saying the role of the state is to support the development of capabilities, and that requires the welfare state. So the establishment of social justice really came from that. This faction developed. The state is involved now in sponsoring welfare programs. And from the early 1900s to probably about 1970, that became the primary role of the state. This social, and the term that became associated with that was social justice. And there's some indication that that was kind of an intentional term. It was having the term justice associated with that made it, gave it real moral force. So this term is used in the early 1900s. You see it used by philanthropists like Jane Addams. Keynes used it in developing his policies. Pope Pius wrote an encyclical about social justice. Roosevelt came into power in the early 1930s with a speech about social justice. There's a monument in Washington still that has a quote about social justice from him on it. Lots of educators picked that up, and they use this idea of social justice in support of vocational education and streaming, which is ironic. This is what gives me pause when I think about social justice. There's maybe nothing in education that has increased inequality as much. What tended to happen is that people that were higher class didn't want their kids to go into vocational education, and so really the streaming sort of gave less educational opportunities to people of lower classes, women, immigrants, any racialized people. But this really picked up this idea of social justice, and this is from an article by the United Nations that looked at a review of social justice, and they say by the mid-20th century, this idea of social justice in politics was central to the programs of all leftist and centrist political parties. It was the dominant ideology of the time, and especially following the Second World War. So a lot of the Western countries at that point sort of implemented wide-scale welfare programs over that to support people. So what it was and what it was not. So it was in this time a term that was used to describe economic just distribution amongst members of a nation state. And that in particular, you can see if you look at the Hansard records from politics in different countries at that time, you see the term social justice coming up over and over. And Hayek noticed that too. He said politicians of all stripes are using this. If they have any opposition to their programs, they say it's for social justice and it gets passed. But the Keynesian Westphalian frame that points out that it was economic in its focus, and it was in nation state in its focus. What it was not is, interestingly, it was not a concept that could be used to apply to issues of identity or representation within countries, or injustices outside of one's country. So it wasn't, I was surprised to find that I couldn't find this term used by leaders of the feminist, civil rights, Black Power movements at all. And that's because it wasn't a term, the injustices they experienced based a lot on their identities were outside of the concerns of social justice. Social justice was being used for certain taxation policies primarily at the time, not to say like a whole class of people is being left out here. The term didn't apply to that. It also was not in the United Nations documents, which is interesting because of the Roosevelt's involvement in developing the human rights doctrine at the time. But this was seen as, social justice was seen as something that a country worked out amongst its citizens. So it wasn't a discourse that was available to criticize injustices that were happening in other nation states. So this became an issue in World War II, where you didn't have a concept that could be used to criticize what was happening with the Holocaust, for example. And the human rights doctrines were introduced for that reason. The term social justice wasn't used in the United Nations documents until the late 1960s, when the USSR started using that term. So yeah, the human rights discourse was developing independently. 1970s onwards is interesting. You have a paradox here, and I've alluded to this already. So you have more and more talk of social justice, and you have less and less programs in support of social justice. So you have two historical processes that are occurring at the same time. You have, in 1971, Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice, and that wasn't directly related to social justice. It's related to distributive justice, but people understood it to mean the same thing. And he articulated a lot of the principles that had been used in social justice discourse previously and practices previously, and made them available for critique through his theoretical conceptualization. And then people criticized it. There's all sorts of books about social justice and distributive justice that were written in response. He wanted to do other things after he wrote that book, but he spent the rest of his life defending that argument because it became so central and sparked such interest. You also, because of other reasons, have the rise of neoliberalism, and I've already talked about that, in the same decade. So you have going on this theoretical proliferation and a lack of a kind of a normative conception of what social justice is, which previously had been used to criticize income inequality, in concert with the rise of a doctrine that really expands inequality. So key points that I just want to highlight, and I want to make sure we have enough time for discussion after, is that social justice in the West is really intertwined with the history of liberalism. And liberalism has been really concerned for individual freedom and well-being. So it's really, social justice is concerned about that, but there's very different views on what that entails, what freedom entails, and what well-being entails, and how you get there. So when we argue about what social justice is, that's what we're really articulating, is what our view is of freedom and well-being. And because of its kind of ensconcement in liberalism, that contributes to the challenge we have in evaluating different notions. It's allowed for its proliferation. One of the characteristics of liberalism is that rights come before goods. So people are able to, everybody should have the right to articulate what is good about their lives for themselves. And that's kind of a keystone of liberal thought. The challenge of that is that it means that it's very hard to make normative claims where you say, like, this is better than that, without seeming to impose a particular view on other people. So that what it leads to is relativism, where everybody can decide what it is, and what the effect of that is it undermines certain concepts that have been key in history. And so liberalism has this kind of inherent contradiction built into it, even though it is very, very clearly prefaced on certain goods. I mean, a good is human freedom, like that individual freedom. That is the good of liberalism, but the very good itself makes it hard to defend a liberal view. So that's just our ensconcement, our entanglement in this ideology has made it challenging to find our way out of this puzzle. Also, we can see that social justice has really become a cultural keyword. This is the work of Raymond Williams, and where he looks at the history of certain terms and whose meaning is part of a larger ideological struggle. And the ideological struggle is semantic, but it also represents something larger. And for a long time, social justice was the domain of social liberals, and they used the term, and others disagreed with it. But now what you have is this real effort, this real struggle to claim it. And the person that can, it's a concept that's evocative and continues to be part of the social imaginary in the West. So there's an effort to claim it for one's own, to support the particular view that one has of personhood and of what the state should be involved in. So when we use the term, we enter into that struggle, and this history helps to explain, okay, this is why it's so contentious. It's contested everywhere, and this is why. So challenges for social justice, certainly the lack of normativity, the lack of a conception where you say, yeah, this is what it means, undermines the power of the term and undermines the ideals that historically have given force to the term. So we have a problem, a problem with understanding what it means, and people that criticize it for that reason have a point. but if anyone can claim it, the term loses its force. Another challenge is that related to normativity is that the goods of social justice are multifaceted. For a long time, it had a normative conception, but it only referred to economics. And that's problematic. That's not the only way that people experience injustice in any particular country or even around the world. There's other aspects to justice as well in a community. Some are related to recognition, representation. There's lots of different ways. It has different faces to it. But how do we have a normative conception of social justice while recognizing that it's multifaceted? That's a challenge to figure out. And then there's new threats to individual freedom. So if that's one of the primary things that we're trying to defend, and what everybody, something we can all agree on is that individual freedom and choice, a new threat is globalization and the rise of transnational powers. So there's new threats to individual freedom that previously weren't acknowledged. Environmental threats, lots of people that are between borders. Social justice conceived only within a nation state says nothing for people that are not citizens, undocumented migrants, says nothing for people that are caught between borders or displaced, refugees displaced because of war. It's not a term that can shed light on those problems. So I'm going to really quickly just go over two notions that I think are able to address those problems quite well. The first is from a philosopher named Nancy Fraser, who has, I'm going to just go click through here, who has a multidimensional framework. And she says, what has often happened in history is that we are busy debating the what, like what are the goods of social justice? Is it recognition or redistribution, economic or identity politics, basically? Like what's the major issue of social justice? And she says we have these different conversations that are happening on all these different levels, and it's just led to this freewheeling discourse where you can't, like, how do you commensurate or reconcile sort of a claim of environmental justice with a claim of class injustices when people that have less opportunities work in industries that may have environmental consequences? So there's these claims that are really hard to reconcile. And we're not sure the discourse it feels out of control a little bit. She also points out another problem is that previously, when it was only within the nation state, social justice was enforced through the public sphere. And because of globalism, that's really broken down. And so transnational actors can act across nations, and we have no way of democratically addressing that. So she proposes a multidimensional framework in a book called Scales of Justice, 2009. If you're interested, you can look at that. But she says the basic good of social justice is participational parity. And so that is that everybody is able to participate equally, socially and politically with their peers. And she said can be lots of reasons why people can't. That can be because for economic reasons, recognition, representation, lots of reasons. But what the basic principle that we're looking at is their ability to participate equally. And then she has two other principles that deal with more in terms of how to deal with social justice claims outside of nation states, probably less relevant to psychologists, but just basically people that are affected and impacted ought to have a way of addressing those injustices. And it requires some other structures of power to do that. I'm not going to get into that here. The other theory I want to talk about is from philosopher Martha Nussbaum, and she has a capabilities approach. So for her, social justice is living a life, the basic good is living a life of human dignity. And she says that comes from 10 central capabilities that every person should have. And they're listed there. So life, bodily health, bodily integrity, etc. She differentiates between or distinguishes between capabilities, which are both have a developmental component to them and an external component in terms of their enactment, and functioning. So functionings would be if we looked at a population and we said, okay, all those people, have appropriate levels of nourishment. That's the functioning. the capability looks at takes a bit more of a subjective look and says, okay, if we have somebody that's malnourished, is that because they don't actually have enough food, or are they currently fasting, or what's the issue? What we want to make sure our focus is that everybody has enough food, and then they have agency to decide how they want to live their life. And part of human dignity is having the agency to make those choices, she says. But what we need to make sure we have is political external support to help with the development of internal capabilities and to enable people to enact their capabilities. So if you take number 10, political and material control over one's environment, you need to have support for to be able to have the skills, the abilities to be able to understand how you do that, to have a certain level of agency, and then the political framework to make that possible. And these two theories, I think, have, I'll just click down here, have implications for psychology and counseling. I think they highlight the way that psychological practices, including counseling and research, can contribute to social justice, but they're not social justice in and of themselves. And sometimes that's conflated. Sometimes it sounds like when we talk about counseling or psychology, that we're just saying, oh, that, I'm doing that, so that's social justice. It just contributes automatically because that's the case. But these frameworks give us the ability to be able to understand the complexity. They point out the complexity of that and different levels of social justice, and to be a bit more realistic in our claims. They also help to provide a way that social justice claims can be indexed against a defensible account. So counselors could say, okay, when I'm working with clients, my aim here is to increase their participational parity, to look at the ways that they are marginalized or to not contribute equally with their peers, and to help to expand those options that they have. Or for Nussbaum, my aim is to increase the capabilities of my clients so they can lead a life of human dignity. But they're indexed against a defensible account that you don't need to explain the whole history every time, but it's against an account that is defensible in terms of the historical development, historical trajectory of social justice. I think it also points to the importance of advocacy, because a lot of what is important in social justice is creating structures or systems that support opportunities for people. And psychology is a really powerful discourse, especially in a neoliberal context. It's really, really powerful. I've had the experience quite often where people will say, oh, you're in psychology, so what do you think about this? And I find myself, even if it's something I don't know anything about, but they're willing to listen. And psychologists communally and counselors communally can have an important role, I think, in advocating for social justice. So just some final thoughts. So in my view, social justice is a term that's worth defending for it because of its history. But I think it really has to be used judiciously. I think we have to stop using it so much and stop assuming that what we're doing is social justice, and be critical of our efforts to promote social justice. Be willing to evaluate. An appeal to social justice is not enough. It really depends on evaluating, which in turn depends on an agreement on the meaning of the term. And I think that history provides that grounds for that justification of a consensus, a particular term. We can argue based on its history for a best account. I think it's really important to be cognizant of the history of psychology. So there's lots and lots of examples in the history of psychology, history of counseling, of things that are ethically problematic. And I think it's very important to be aware of those and to kind of have those at the forefront of one's mind. And I mean, in education as well, like I'm always given pause when I think about how the term is used for streaming, and that argument kind of stretched, was used to support residential schools. So there's an example of how we can use rhetoric or use terms in ways that are unjust. And I think in psychology, I'm really, and this is a constant challenge, because just working in this field, you end up psychologizing problems, because that's what we do. We advance this language of psychology. But the tendency, I'm just always torn between this tension of, okay, I'm in this field, I work in this field, my very presence in a room or a conversation often means that the discourse turns towards psychology, which has the effect of individualizing problems, which can support this agenda of neoliberalism, which is being shown to increase inequality. So I'm not even sure the way forward with that. Maybe that's something to discuss in your discussion groups. But I guess just to be cognizant of it, to be really conscious of the way that our field tends to individualize sociocultural and economic problems. Okay, and that is it for me. I will stop my share and turn it back to Rob.
Okay, Dr. Thrift, at the bottom is a Q&A tab. And if you click that, looks like I think we have about 6 questions here. And pretty much all you need to do is pick the one you want to answer and click the button that says answer live, and then go ahead and answer the question. I think one person stated at the beginning of their question, they don't want to be identified.
Okay, yeah.
Put in the chat that if you don't want to be identified, let us know. And yeah, people have also messaged that they don't mind being identified. So I'll leave.
Okay, maybe I just want to identify anyone. I'm just reading the questions. Sorry, the questions are, nobody else can see these questions. Is that right?
No, just you and I.
Okay, so I can read them out maybe. So someone who does research in clinical psychology asks, does a commitment to produce research that advances social justice interfere with our commitment to produce research that advances our understanding of psychology? I can see it doing so by shaping our research questions at conception and our interpretation at analysis. Yeah, well, I think it's this tension that I alluded to. So I think that I don't think advancing clinical psychology is inherently against social justice necessarily, but I think there's this constant tension. I think what's important in psychology is to recognize that features of people are constituted by the structures in which they're formed. So that is, that is just a tension within that. And then explicate what's wrong with, I hope I answered that question. What's wrong with IQ tests? They're very important for neuropsychological test interpretation. Yeah, and nothing particularly wrong now, but if you look at the history of their development early on in the 1900s, they were used to advance really problematic views of certain racial groups. And some people that were involved in developing IQ tests were involved in eugenics as well. So there's a whole history on that. I'm not an expert in that, but that is something to look up. Someone else says, whenever things like social justice are discussed in academic settings, people are very passionate. Oh boy, it's jumping around. Dominate the discourse, and assumption of agreement results. People who may agree to some extent but have some criticisms are terrified to speak up. How do we raise this problem with those who are leading our institutions who seem to be unaware that it is an issue? Yeah, I think that's a good problem. And this research is my effort to insert myself into that conversation in a way that's like, I'm not against social justice in any way. I've been on multiple boards of nonprofits that are, intended to advance social justice. I think what I'd like to see us do is be better in our work on that. And I think we can look at it historically. There's historical examples of, in education particularly, of using that term in ways that we now would say, oh yeah, that doesn't work, or using the term in very limited ways. So I think that those historical examples are helpful. To comment, I learned a lot. Oh, it's jumping around on me again. Important for psychologists to understand. Okay, the US military won't recruit anyone for any type of work if their IQ is below 85. They ultimately want to recruit as many people as possible, and IQ testing is rooted in military and organizational selection. Can you clarify the problems around intelligence testing as a problem of neoliberalism? there is 10 to 15% of the population is simply unable to find work due to their cognitive abilities and problems they haven't been able to address socially by any political party movement. So yeah, I'm not an expert in any means on IQ tests. That seems to have picked up a lot of interest there, but there are people that write on that quite a lot. And I'm talking about historically, the historical development of IQ tests in the early 1900s. So that is something that I think is best, I don't feel like I can talk about that a lot right now, but just to point out, I think that my point with that was that there are historical problems in psychology, that psychology is not a blameless field, and that we need to be aware and have those at the forefront of our minds. Okay, another question is APA overstepping. I believe that the primary duty of clinical psychology is to help people through their problems. Should we take on the problems of the social and political domain, or might this betray the trust necessary for a productive clinical relationship? I think sometimes psychology does overstep, and I think that's problematic because I think education does too sometimes, because it detracts attention from the larger political responsibility for creating social justice. Some things are there, that's not, the psychologist might be helping this individual person. I think the problem comes when we call everything that we do, social justice. That becomes the issue. What happened historically? So social justice, a concept not used by early feminists and civil rights activists, came to be central in the thinking, or at least rhetoric, of many feminists and multicultural psychologists. And it's Alan. Hi, Alan. I think what he says, he could be identified. So I think what happened is that after Rawls published A Theory of Justice, a lot of other groups criticized the views about social justice that had been used that only prioritized economic distribution, and said there's more, like, this is not a primary issue of injustice for everybody. Other issues relate to identity and to recognition. And so recognition actually became a major thrust in social justice in the 1990s. And Nancy Fraser and some others have written about this, how identity politics kind of took over the social justice discourse for a time, unfortunately at the same time that neoliberalism was advancing. So it kind of eliminated this economic critique from its discourse, and you had instead a focus on identity politics. Now, identity is important for social justice, but so is economic distribution, and so is political representation. So then the need is that we have to find a way of including all of those facets, not just if you have a view of social justice that is focused only on one. And I think sometimes in psychology, because we're interested in identity, we focus on that aspect and we don't talk about class very often. Then I think it's problematic in light of the history of social justice.
Okay, that looks like the sixth and last question that people have posted. Does anybody else have any question? If so, please quickly type it up in the Q&A. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, hold on, there's one coming right here, Erin. Oopsies. So, actually, Erin, I have Dan Cox as the co-host, so he gets his question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
That's really for us to communicate. So if you want to,
can I see that in the chat?
Yeah, you should be able to see it. Can you? There should be a chat button there. If not, I'll
oh yeah. Okay. Okay. Oh, so Dan Cox. I think everybody can see that, right? Or do I need to read it?
No, just me. How about I read the question out, Erin? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So, with the aim of contributing to social justice, oops, sorry, with the aim of contributing to social justice, what would be something that you would encourage faculty in applied psychology training programs to do or continue to do? Inversely, is there something that you would encourage us to stop doing?
So I think what I would encourage people to do is to be able to encourage or to help psychologists or counselors to understand how structures of inequality influence people at just even the most deepest, most embodied level. And I like Bourdieu's work on that, but I think it's important to understand how people are formed in institutional contexts, how that impacts people, and not to be so focused on necessarily traits that seem to be individualistic apart from any sort of social context. So I think a lot of faculty do that already, but I think that is really important. I think also just challenging people with what do you mean when you say you're going to do social justice? How can you show that that's going to happen? Encouraging this type of constant reflection and evaluation, thinking, reading interdisciplinary accounts as well, I think is really helpful. I think often in psychology, well, maybe this has changed, but in my own psychological training, quite often there's a very narrow focus and I didn't read outside the discipline in a way that would have helped me to understand some of the problems that I was seeing. I might have had intuitions about them, but I think there's a lot in philosophy that's good, sociology that's great. So working in an interdisciplinary way is really helpful. And then just what not to do, I'm just cautious of using, I mean, I use the term, I sit on the anti-racism committee, I teach a cultural considerations course, I teach about social justice, but I encourage counselors to think really judiciously about how they use the concept, how they use the words what the words that they're using mean, and what the political implications are of those terms.
Okay, I think that takes us to the end of the questions. Just to let people know, in about a minute, we'll conclude the official portion of the talk. I have it set up, and I believe it's supposed to work after talking to UBCIT, that when you close the webinar, it'll automatically redirect you to the Zoom link for people who would like to stick around and have a discussion in breakout rooms. Just in case it does not work, I've just put my email out into the chat for everybody, and you can email me if that doesn't work and you'd like to participate. I can send you the Zoom link. Okay, so I'm going to end it off here, and we might see some people over into the chat. Thank you. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thrift, for being our kickoff speaker. I really enjoyed your talk, and I hope that our students, faculty, and guests from the Heterodox Academy enjoyed it as well.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for organizing.
Welcome. Bye-bye.